1764, Thomas Jefferson was a 21-year-old college student. He was shy, bashful, and he was in love. But he did not have the courage to ask his intended for her hand. When he finally worked it up, finally got the courage, he went to her, asked for her hand in marriage, and she said no. Flat no. Crushed it. For the next 20 years, he was writing about that heartbreak in his journals. That was in 1764. In that same year, 1764, James Madison was a 12-year-old schoolboy. He had been infirm most of his life, early life. He was bedridden for a long that. And so he finally opted for boarding school. And his parents write back and forth with the schoolmaster, letters between them, talk about how smart he was, but he was shy and bashful and awkward. Probably would never amount to anything. James Madison, fourth president, right? That was in 1764. In 1764, John Adams had just graduated from Harvard. He was working on his law studies. He married Abigail, his wife, that October. And he wrote in his journal that once he got his law degree, he was so excited he would never leave Massachusetts or Braintree, Massachusetts area again. Of course, we know that he spent most of the next 20 years away from his family. That was in 1764. In that same year, George Washington was an unsuccessful farmer and businessman. The debts were piling up, couldn't pay his taxes. Anybody relate to that? Couldn't pay his taxes, and he was in somewhat of despair in 1764. However, little more than a decade after that, these gentlemen and others declared independence from the strongest military power on the planet. A decade after that, they combined with others, and they created a form of government that has provided more freedom for more people than any nation on the face of the earth. But in 1764, they were just ordinary men, nothing special to offer. How do you go from ordinary to the greatest statesman in history? How do you do that? Were these men better than us? Were they genetically superior to us? No. But they were trained to be Americans. And their society had very different expectations for them than ours does for us today. They were the beneficiaries of a unique kind of education, culture, and environment. And because they were able to overcome their weaknesses and develop tools and strengths to found this great nation we have, what we enjoy today. It's unique in all the history of the world. Unfortunately, most of us have never actually been exposed to the America that the founders gave us. So that's what I want to talk about today. As real estate investors, we are part of one of the most important businesses in America. Buying and controlling real estate helps our country's economy in ways that nothing else does. But controlling real estate helps more than just the economy. It's the very core of freedom and the American dream. And that dream is under attack, yes or no? Yes. In fact, I would submit it's on life support. So this morning, we're going to talk about some very important things. We're going to talk about what it means to be an American. We're going to talk about how we're losing our country, and we're going to talk about how we, as investors and controllers of real estate, can stop that and reverse it. There are 5 ideals upon which America has been founded. You should all have a handout in front of you. There are 5 ideals upon which America was based. 4 of them were already lost. Now remember, this is an America that many of you may not have been exposed to. 4 of them already lost. Freedom is the one that we still know of, but it's almost gone. So what are the other 4? Well, let's talk about, first of all, this concept of American. Think of it. American. That word actually used to mean something. You can be American, and you can be un-American. You can be un-American even if you were born here. You can't be un-Irish. You're born in Ireland. If you're Irish, you're born in Ireland. You can't be un-Saudi Arabian. But you can be un-American. You can't be un-Chinese. See, being Chinese means what? It means that that's your bloodline. That's your lineage. But being an American is not about lineage.
Being an American is about living a certain way based on certain ideals. So what are those ideals? Let's talk about them. I guess I have to click this. The first one is called Georgics. Now, this may be a word that's new to you. It's new to most people, but it was not new to the American founders. It was in their letters and journals and speeches and sermons and newspaper editorials. It was all through their public debate. Georgics, 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 they talked about it all the time. What is this thing? Georgics is a word that's derived from Latin and Greek. It literally means to work the land or agricultural efforts. It was first used by the Latin poet Virgil in 30 BC, and the founders adopted it because they loved the concept. They admired this quality, and so they made it theirs. The best way to explain this concept for us in modern days is to translate the word into something that we understand. Owner. When the founders said Georgics, what they meant was owner. So the first of the 4 lost American ideals, remember, these ideals are all connected. If you've lost 4, what's happening to the last one? It's being drugged down because they're all connected. The only way to save the last one, freedom, is to bring the other 4 back afloat. So when the founders said Georgics, they meant owner. But they didn't use the word owner. The words they used were independent and dependent. And I'll walk through that for you. At the beginning of our nation, when we were first declaring independence, the American founders argued about different philosophies. What kind of America should we have? Hamilton and Jefferson led that debate, and they got most of their ideas from a guy named Montesquieu, from a book called The Spirit of the Laws. He was a French and political philosopher. And he said there are only 3 motivations, 3 reasons why civilizations rise up. Nations, societies either thrive as martial societies, religious societies, or commercial societies. Now, a martial society is just that. It's a society that loves war, loves to fight. That's honorable for them. You can think of the Spartans or the Roman Empire, the early American Indians. The founders got together and said, you know what? As good as that might be, America's not going to be a martial nation, a martial state. Religious state, that's the second one. And that is a state or a society that's guided by religion, the tenets of that religion, and all aspects of society. Examples would be the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Taliban, modern-day ISIS. You're hearing about it in the news every day. The founders agreed that they wanted a good people and that the Bible was a good book, but they didn't want religion to be in charge of society. They wanted it to flavor society, but not be in charge. So they said no. I don't think I'm following my slides. There we go. Montesquieu's last form of society, a type of society, was what was called the commercial society, and the founders said, yeah, we like that one. The idea is to set up a social structure in a government to support and promote commercial enterprise and success for those who work hard and are smart with their money. Anybody agree with that approach to life? Yeah. And a government system that's designed to promote property rights and promote ingenuity and creativity. Both Jefferson and Hamilton agreed, yes, this is a good idea, we want this, but what kind of commercial society? Because there's 2 types. Hamilton said, let's set up America this way. Let's set up a commercial society that is pretty much has everybody working for the big industrial organizations and the big corporations in a city environment, and there'll be a few people who make a lot of money, and everybody else is subsistence level. Employees, just making enough to get by, with a few big owners. What do you think Jefferson said to that? He refused that. He said, you know what, that's wrong. That's not how you protect freedom and liberty. So he suggested that the best way to protect freedom is to set up a society where millions of Americans are owners. Small farms, small ranches, small businesses, shops, coopers, newspapers, you name it. Such a variety, all owned privately. And then have a government system in place that protects those as much as possible. Jefferson said, when a people live independent, they think, act, and vote independent. And that's the best way to protect freedom. So Hamilton and Jefferson fighting back and forth. And today, we talk with, they use the words dependent and independent. They said you're either going to have a nation of dependence or you're going to have a nation of independence. Our modern translation of those two words today are owner and employee. Now, dependent is an employee. Think about this for a second. This employee in every way is dependent on their employer for what? For everything. Where does their money come from? The rest of their life. There's nothing that has greater impact in your life than money. Because everything you do, good, bad, indifferent, is money. And if you're dependent on one person or one entity for all of that every month, guess what you are? A dependent. I can't hear you. What? You're a dependent. That's right. On the other hand, an independent is an owner. An independent is Georgic. Now, you don't have to be a farmer to be Georgic, but you have to be independent. Owners provide, or Georgics provide jobs for other people, or at least provide for themselves without being dependent on anyone else. Does that make sense? What do we have today? A nation of dependence or independence? Dependence. Hence, 4 lost American ideals are dying. Liberty is shrinking because of that very concept. Owners do not look to others or government for their maintenance. They count on the freedom protected by law to give them the environment and liberty to be creative, productive, active members of society who provide for themselves not only financially and politically. Now, most of us, I want to make a connection between Strongbrook and liberty. And I know that Chris has been talking about it, and that's good, and I'm glad he is, but I want to make a stronger connection for you. We all have our reasons for wanting to build our businesses, Strongbrook, improve our families, our finances, better life, secure retirement. Let me add one more to your list, and I hope you write this down in bold letters. Liberty. Here's why. The single most important thing you could do to protect liberty is to encourage people to own property. Property has financial ramifications, and property ownership has political ramifications. If you don't understand what that means, find me after this lecture and I will explain it to you. Steve Palmer will explain it to you. You want to get people involved politically? Don't tell them to join a party, get them to buy property. Then when the laws start going bad, what do people do? They get concerned and up in arms because you're messing with my property. You get it? All right. I'm getting off track here already. Georgics, independents, owners. This concept is at the very heart of American freedom. Well, Jefferson won the argument. He said, he won the argument with Hamilton, and most of America went that direction. In fact, if you go back 1776, about 90% of the northern part of the United States were owners. 100 years later, 1900, 90% of the population in general were owners of their lands, of their businesses, some sort of enterprise. We truly were a nation of independence. Then a shift occurred, and the ideas of Hamilton took place. By 2014, this year, just over 100 years later, less than 10% of Americans are owners. Now, with less than 10% as owners, the impact on freedom has been devastating. Jefferson was right. You cannot have national independence without a nation of independence. Do you get it? A nation of dependents or employees can never be free. Number 2. I guess I should hit this. Okay. The second ideal that's lost is the concept of providence. Now, I go around the country and I've asked people all over for the last 20 years, what does providence mean? I get all kinds of answers. It means hand of God, it means Lady Luck, it means what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, whatever, right? If you go back to the Federalist Papers, 1788, you're going to find the word providence all over the place. Providence wants America to do this. Providence wants us to do that. They talk about providence all the time. What did they mean when they said providence? What they meant was that if you're an American, you believe in God. Pure and simple. That's what being an American in the 17, 18, and early 1900s meant in this country. During the European Enlightenment, the Europeans thought it was quaint that Americans still had God in their dialogue. In fact, up to a couple decades ago, Europeans talked about how shocked they were to find that Americans were still talking about God. Today, we almost never talk about God. The concept of God as being a fundamental part of the character of an American is lost. Oh, you may have it in your little bubbles in places where you live in your little, but in general, in the country, 317 million people, we don't talk about God anymore. It's lost. But to the founding generation, providence was more than just a belief in God, a higher power. It had a deeper meaning, and we've lost that as well. Beyond the belief of an existence in God, the early Americans believed that God had also given each one of us a purpose, a mission, a task specific to us that we were to complete in this life. Let me say this a little bit different. The founding generation believed that not only was there a God, but there was a supreme being that had a very personal and specific mission for each of us to fulfill. They believed that in a culture where people were supposed to search out their missions, everybody here would have a mission. We would all know that everyone had a mission. You may not know what it is yet. That's your job. Go find it. And once you find it, then you fulfill it. Can you imagine a culture like that? Would that change anything in America today if we had continued that culture? Would things be a little different here? Providence meant that my whole life would be spent fulfilling a mission from on high. It would impact my actions and decisions. It would influence my character and relationships. Mission would drive what I did for a living, who I married, how I raised my family, how I treated my neighbors, how I impacted my community. Providence, in addition to being a belief in God, was a fundamental, formative principle in the founding of this nation, and it is gone. And that has had a very negative impact on freedom. When the founders said that they were Americans, what they meant was they believed in freedom. When the founders said that they were Americans, what it meant was they believed in a higher power. And they believed they had a mission. When the founders said they were Americans, what they meant was they were owners. We need more Americans in America. And you're the ones that are going to lead this out. You can't help it. If you're going to own property, if you're going to encourage other people to own property, this is my motivation. It's not the money. For years now, I've been fundraising different projects. Money doesn't do it for me. This does it for me. If I can find ways to help other people become financially free and save liberty in the land, I'll be up. You can't sleep when that's burning in you. Get it? Is that burning in you? Okay. Now, perhaps this sounds very much like a domestic topic, this being American, but it really has a broader impact. I think we can all agree that American domestic policy can have an impact on buying and selling of real estate. Yes or no? Yes, it can. But American foreign policy also has a direct impact. In the world of international relations, there are basically three different ideas. Sorry. That was great. I didn't start my timer. Okay, good. I know how much time I have. Realism is the first one. Realism dictates that international relations are governed by internal national security concerns and are manifested by what we call a balance of power. Think of the relationship between France and Spain and England during most of the history of Europe. See that balance of power? That's because they were worried about internal national security issues. That's one approach to international relations. Another approach to international relations is what we call idealism. And idealism holds that the state should make its internal political philosophy its foreign policy, and is characterized by international collective security approaches like the League of Nations or NATO or the United Nations. Okay? Those are two different kinds that are out there, the two predominant. We as Americans in the United States have a third option, or a third theory called American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism suggests that the United States of America is different than Europe and Asia, fundamentally different. America doesn't share the political and warfare history that the vast majority of the world does. It was founded in a very different way with very different philosophy, which means that America should do things different than the rest of the world. You would think that that would be a good thing, and that it would provide a buffer for American citizens and immigrants from the folly of the rest of the world. But you can only have the advantages of American exceptionalism if you experience American exceptionalism. And you can't have American exceptionalism unless you have America. And you cannot have America unless you have Americans living the 5 American ideals. You get that? So we have a dilemma. If we don't have real Americans, we lose the protection and promise of American exceptionalism. It's not there. It's not a theory. We get to decide whether that we have access to the third option or not by our own actions. It's not what the Republican Party does or the Democratic Party does. It's what Wileen does at her house. Wileen, you're carrying it for all of us. It's what you do in your own homes. It's your relationships. It's being out of debt. It's all these things we're talking about. That's the foundation of liberty. All right, let's go on to the third one. Liber is the third lost American ideal. This is, again, another word new for our time, but very familiar to the founding period. Liber is the Latin botanical term for tree bark. And I know you can see the significance right away. It is also the root word for library, liberty, and liberal, as in liberal arts education. So what's the connection? What's the relationship between tree bark, liberty, and library? The idea of a strong liberal arts education and liberty have always had a close relationship. More precisely, these two concepts are connected by the idea that you deserve to be as free as what you know. I'm going to say that again. You deserve to be as free as what you know. By the way, on the back side of your handout, there's a link. If you go to that link, you'll get a transcript of this lecture for free. Okay? You deserve to be as free as what you know. History is a monument to the idea that your freedom is based on what you know, what you understand, and how you apply that knowledge to your life. I mentioned tree bark. In ancient times, tree bark, among other things like animal skin, papyrus, those kinds of things, were used to record history, engage in commercial transactions, communicate in general. In ancient Greece and Rome, if you had a skill set of reading and writing and calculating and engaging in contract and such, using tree bark, you were considered liber. If you didn't, you were either a slave or you're part of the very poor class. Now, let's not confuse literacy with liber. They're not the same thing. There were slaves who could read, but liber is so much more. Liber gives you the power to understand the meaning behind the words and phrases and the ability to interact with others in such a way as to fulfill your mission, increase your wealth, and impact society. In ancient Rome, there were two classes of society, slaves and liber. And I would submit today that those two classes are in existence right now. We are either a part of the liber class or we have a basic literacy and we're part of the modern slave class. Fortunately, anybody can move from the slave class into the liber class, but guess who has to do the work? It's not something people can give you, right? Let me better explain liber by saying it this way. Historically, there have been three types of education. Employee education, which is just that. It gives you a general education, basic literacy, designed to give you just enough skill set to get and keep a job. Then there's professional education. That is training into a narrow field or specific field like counting or law or medicine, basically to become an expert, to have expertise in an area. And then there's liber education. What is the fundamental difference between these three? Well, for starters, they have very different goals. The goal of employee education is to teach basic literacy and teach people what to think, to do what they're told, to follow orders. In our current environment, the vast majority of the U.S. citizens, more than 60%, will never achieve more than this level of education. They will never be liber, they will never be truly Americans. not free Americans who think for themselves. What's the goal of professional education? To train you to think within the parameters of your chosen field, but not to really question or think too much outside of that. To train you to be an expert. Some 30% of the Americans, of U.S. citizens today, have received this level of education. And while they're clearly making more money than those who are just in the employee education, I'm not sure that they're any freer with all those extra years of education. The goal of leadership education is to train a person how to think. You see the difference? What to think, when to think, how to think. To question, to ponder, to calculate, to challenge. Not to be a troublemaker, but to ensure the stability and soundness of culture and society. The purpose of library education is to create a nation of thinkers, because a nation of thinkers will be a nation of owners, and a nation of citizens pursuing providence, and that is the only way to protect freedom. There is nothing wrong with being an employee. Please don't take offense. There's nothing wrong with being an employee or being an expert. But a nation of employees, a nation of experts, is a nation that will never be a nation of free citizens. Fundamentally, it can't happen. History is filled with examples of this. Think of the Chinese dynasties or the tyrannies of Mesopotamia. Modern examples, Bismarck's unification of Germany and Austria, Stalin's USSR, Mao's China. I could make a strong case that the same thing is happening right here in the United States today. Let me give you this quote. This is George S. Counts. "We must abandon completely the naive faith that education automatically liberates the mind and serves the cause of human progress. In fact, we know that it may serve any cause. It may serve tyranny as well as truth, war as well as peace, death as well as life. Whether it is good or evil depends not on the laws of learning, but on the conception of life and civilization that gives it substance and direction." It's what you believe in here that determines what education does. In the course of history, education has served every purpose and doctrine contrived by man. If it is to serve the cause of human freedom, it must be explicitly designed for that purpose. So now you have to ask yourselves, what type of education serves tyranny and war and evil? What type of education serves good and truth and peace and freedom? Well, how do you tell what an education system is designed for? How do you know that? Easy. You go back in history and you look what other countries and kingdoms have used education for. How have they used it and what were the results they accomplished? Then you can tell. Conquering nations that wanted to unify, they came in and took over a new population, they wanted to control it, would force them to all study the same curriculum. Kind of a conveyor belt approach. Often changing or deleting much of the history of the culture. They would use textbooks especially designed to manipulate the people to think a certain way that always benefits the rulers. These methods were designed to override individualism, to force the people to fit in, to conform to a path that best suited the government or the ruling class. There were other realms that used intricate systems of experts at many different levels. Chinese comes to mind. To manage and govern the people. There were different languages used even to control the people. The government would speak one language, the people would speak another. Unless you could speak the government language, you could not interface with the government. You couldn't be in government. That's how you control the people. These methods have been used for centuries to train followers and employees, to create a population that follows the lead of the ruling class and does not rock the boat. These methods were and are very efficient in training the masses to do what they're told, to follow whatever leader's in place, regardless where they're leading, to do repetitive tasks, to stay in their place, to do their job without question. These methods are not designed for the benefit of the people at large. They are not designed to improve freedom or individual happiness and wealth. There we go. In 1840, Alexis de Tocqueville spoke of these methods and the kind of control in his world-renowned book, Democracy in America. He's speaking of the future he saw for America, and he's talking about the government that would be in place at the time. And he said, above this race of men stands an immense and tutelary power, which takes upon itself alone to secure their gratifications and to watch over their fate. That power is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. It would be like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, its object was to prepare men for manhood. But it seeks, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. It is well content that the people should rejoice, provided they think of nothing but rejoicing. For their happiness, such a government willingly labors, but it chooses to be the sole agent and only arbiter of that happiness. It provides for their security. Now think of modern America. It provides for their security, foresees and supplies their necessities, facilitates their pleasures, manages their principal concerns, directs their industry, regulates the descent of property, and subdivides their inheritances. What remains but to spare them all the care of thinking and of all the trouble of living? Thus, it every day renders the exercise of free agency, liberty, of man less useful and less frequent. It circumscribes the will within a narrow range and gradually robs of man of all the uses of himself. The principle of equality has prepared men for these things. It has disposed men to endure them and often to look upon them as benefits. That was 170 years ago. Tocqueville is known as the prophet of America. Library education has always been very different from employee or expert education. And early American education was very different from what we have today. Education in America from 1607 to the 1940s, nearly 350 years, was library education. It was designed to create yeomen, a specific kind of human being that could fend for themselves, who were self-governing, self-regulating, self-reliant, self-determinate, autonomous, and private. In a word, independent. Can you imagine an education system that is designed to create independent Americans? I think you could make a case that we have something else going on in America today. Instead of a manipulated and directed curriculum, library education promotes the study of classics, of history and war and literature and science and mathematics, the arts, debate and rhetoric, ancient languages, diplomacy, leadership, etc., both from the Eastern and the Western worlds. It encourages deep study and pondering, probing questions, and the challenging of historical assumptions. If a tradition cannot stand up to questioning, it's probably not much of a tradition. Rather than teachers who force a specific curriculum on a student, library education uses mentors to guide and inspire students through their studies, often adding readings around the student's interests. The entire purpose of library education is to assist in the development of the student based on his or her providential mission or purpose. The point is that if you want to be an American, if you want your family to be American, if you love freedom and independence, you have to be liber. Say it. You have to be, we get used to using that word, liber. You have to be liber. If you want to succeed in your businesses, you cannot depend on Chris and Kevin and Stephen to do everything. They've got a good system for us. We have to use our brains. We have to become investors. Right? If you don't have an investor mindset, what are the chances that they're going to be able to really do a great program for you? None. We have to become liber. And that means know everything about everything. It'll take you a lifetime, don't worry. What are the chances that your children will become liber if you are not? What are the chances that your posterity will be American if you are not? Now, at this point, I want to create a distinction between what we're talking about. Everything we've covered so far up to this point is for all Americans. Okay? This next concept that I want to talk about, the fourth lost American ideal. By the way, what are the first three we talked about? We talked about Georgics, Providence. Very good. Is it up there? No, it's not up there. Okay, good. Very good. I want to talk about the fourth lost American ideal, and it's for a very special group. This is a group of you who have basically made it. You're already owners. You already pretty much know what your mission is. You have a sense of that. You're on your way, or I've already achieved library education. You're there. You're the people in this organization and group that, whether you're in administration of Strongbrook or not, people look up to you. You're the leaders. Those of you who have made it, moved on, you're benefiting from all the things that we talk about, you're already there. The fourth lost American ideal is for you. The fourth lost American ideal is a concept called public virtue. This is another phrase that's been lost. When I talk about public virtue, people say, oh, that means being virtuous in public. And though that is a good thing to do, that's not what the founders meant when they said public virtue. I've had other people say, that means being virtuous in public office. Heaven knows, that would be a good thing. As unlikely as that is in American politics today. But that is not what the founders meant when they said public virtue. When the early Americans talked about public virtue, they were quoting the ancient Greeks. The early Americans were library educated, and they read the Greek and Roman writings. They didn't do it because they were forced to. They did it because they were building a new society, and they wanted a society of free men and women, of owners. So they were looking for the freedom recipe. In the ancient Greek and Roman writings, they found detailed discussions about virtue. But there were many different kinds of virtue. It's sort of like the Eskimos. The Eskimos have at least 10 different languages for the word that we would translate to snow. Why? Well, because they have cold snow and ice snow and soft snow and quiet snow and loud snow. They have all these different kinds of snow, and they have different words for them. We would just put them all in one thing and translate it as snow. Well, the Greeks did the same thing. They have lots of different words for different kinds of virtue. When we translated that into English, we had to add descriptive words to clarify what kind of virtue we're talking about. So the Greeks talked about religious virtue, manly virtue, private virtue, public virtue, feminine virtue. Lots of different kinds of virtues. Now, even though the founders thought that private virtue was a good thing, most of their writings talk about public virtue. Why? Because private is private. I'm not going to tell you how to be private virtue, how to have private virtue, but I am going to talk about how to have public virtue. Because public virtue means voluntarily sacrificing personal benefit for the good of society. Now, in the years that I've been teaching this, I have found that most of us go, what? Because we don't really see examples of this in our culture, and so we don't really even know what it means. The founders not only valued public virtue as a means of becoming an American, but they practiced it. Thomas Jefferson, as well as 55 other founders, at the time signed their names to an illegal document. You know what that illegal document was? Declaration of Independence. It was illegal at the time. They risked everything. They put their lives on the line for their freedom and for the freedom of countless generations. Because we have a national employee education system in our country, we have lost a lot of our history. We seldom hear about the acts of public virtue done by past Americans, which is a good reason why we don't have too many acts of public virtue with modern Americans, right? We have no role models. While there are literally hundreds of accounts of American public virtue, in interest of the time and to better understand public virtue, allow me to share a couple of these stories with you. You may have heard of Jefferson writing and signing the Declaration of Independence, but you may not have heard of what happened afterwards. Once the Declaration was signed and circulated, all of the signers were charged with high treason. And if I had time, I'd go through the process. If you were prosecuted and convicted of high treason, what they would do with your body. The English did this clear up until the 1850s. So this was very well documented. So all of these signers had warrants out for the arrest. They were all in hiding. Jefferson was at the top of the list. Ooh, if we could just get our hands on the guy who wrote the document. That would really send a message. So they went to Monticello to find Jefferson. He wasn't there, but his wife and child were. As the British approached that day to Monticello, she was warned. She ran into the woods in the snow with her child. They both later died They were able to avoid the British, but they both later died from complications from exposure. Now, Jefferson was willing to sacrifice himself. He wasn't probably thinking about sacrificing his family. But inadvertently that happened. And he lived with that loss for the next 60 years of his life. That, ladies and gentlemen, is public virtue. Voluntarily sacrificing personal benefit for the good of society. Those who engage in public virtue do not get to choose the sacrifice or the severity. All they can do is see where the world is, see where it should be, put themselves in between, and hope that their sacrifice will bridge the gap for future generations. Do we teach that? Is this a concept we teach in our education system, that we should do this? No. Another signer of the Declaration of Independence was Robert Morris. Now, at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, Robert Morris was the richest man in the colonies. By the time the war was over, the Constitutional Convention had convened, and the nation was up and running. Robert Morris not only had lost all his money, but he had spent time in debtor's prison. What happened to the money? How do you go from richest man to debtor's prison? It's suggested that he probably had some problems in his later life and bad business dealings, but there is no doubt that during the first years of the war, Robert Morris was another indispensable man, just as indispensable as Washington. He poured the equivalent of millions of dollars into the war effort. On numerous occasions, General George Washington found himself with no money to keep the war going. With his back against a wall, he would send out a message, "Get me Robert Morris." Morris would come, they'd explain the situation, he'd put out some money, go fundraise for the rest. They were able to fund that battle. Washington lost the first 10 battles in 1776. This happened over and over again through that whole year. Congress was not paying, was not providing any money. The colonies weren't providing. Half the people in America at that time, leadership did not want Washington as the general. They thought he was a local yokel, couldn't do the job. But Morris is still funding every one of these battles. 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 10. And every battle, what? Lost. Remember the Battle of Trenton. Maybe you remember that, but I bet you remember this. This is the great art of crossing the Delaware. This painting depicts probably the most pivotal point of the war. Washington had lost every battle. Nobody's funding him, except for Robert Morris. And he lost every battle up until this one. Now, in those days, you didn't fight war during the wintertime. The British found a nice encampment, and the Americans found a not so nice encampment. And they survived through the winter, separate, not fighting, and then in the spring they'd come back together and go at it. And knowing this, and knowing that he was up against a wall, unpopular, real big problems, Washington pulled his generals together and said, we've got to come up with a plan. We've got to find a way to turn this war around, and very quickly. So the plan was to cross the Delaware River from Pennsylvania into New Jersey and attack the British forces at Trenton on Christmas Eve when no one was expecting it. It was a daring plan. It was fantastic. Washington said, make it happen. Not long after that, the generals came back to him and said, slight problem. We don't have enough guns, shot, or powder to mount an attack. Also, we don't have enough soldiers with shoes and pants to weather the storm. No one has been fed a full meal recently, and there are no boats to cross the water. And by the way, everybody in your army right now are on single 1-year enlistments, and their enlistments are up in 2 weeks. Washington said, what? Get me Robert Morris. Morris came on horseback through winter weather, listened to the plan, said, that's a great plan. And then he said, oh, by the way, I'm 100% broke. I've used up my entire fortune funding the American Revolution. Washington, who never showed emotion in public, is said to have dropped his face into his hands and said, then all is lost. Can you imagine being Robert Morris walking out of that meeting? Well, he had no money. He was completely broke. But he went to friends and said, hey, would you loan to the Continental Congress? Would you loan to the government and so we can keep the war effort going? And his friends said, what? No. We'll never see repayment. We'll never get paid back. Then he said, would you loan to me? Remember, penniless. Would you loan to me? And they said, yeah, we'll loan to you. Signature loan for the equivalent of millions of dollars. The money that was gathered and dispersed to Washington, cold and hungry soldiers were clothed and fed, thanks to Robert Morris. Boats were secured, thanks to Robert Morris. Guns and powder and shot were purchased and delivered, again, Robert Morris. The battles of Trenton and Princeton were so successful, they turned the tide of the war and led to American freedom and the development of the United States and the freedom that we enjoy today, all because of a man named Robert Morris. A man who understood liberty, a man who was an owner, who understood providence, who was library educated, in a phrase, an American. A man who had been wildly successful as a large merchant and financier, but when the time had come, he put it all on the line to secure freedom for his own grandchildren and for us. That, ladies and gentlemen, is public virtue. Voluntarily sacrificing. Voluntary sacrificing, personal benefit for the good of society. Last story and then we're done. I've got time here. For most of the 8 years of the American Revolution, the Americans were losing. To make matters worse, the Continental dollar was worthless, so the American army could not purchase needed supplies, while the British were purchasing American goods with gold and silver. American shopkeepers and farmers were, in essence, aiding and abetting the British. The American Congress was restricted in power to make war due to the limitations of the Articles of Confederation, which were the law at the time. Unable to pass laws to help the war effort, Congress passed a resolution. In essence, a suggestion. They asked an unknown number of shopkeepers and farmers to stop selling to the British. But knowing full well that if the British were not allowed to purchase the goods, they would simply take them at gunpoint, the American Congress asked these private citizens to destroy anything the British could use to make war against the Americans. Hundreds of shopkeepers walked into their shops and poured kerosene over the counters and the candy and the bolts of cloth and the farm implements and the seed, lit the match, walked out onto cobblestone with their families, and watched their entire livelihoods burn to the ground. Dozens of farmers walked into fields ready to harvest, struck the match, and let the fields be destroyed rather than give the British a chance to have supplies. They moved into winter without any food to survive the coming hardship. These families were never reimbursed by the government. We don't even know their names, but we can never forget their actions. My friends, that is public virtue. Voluntarily sacrificing personal benefit for the good of society. Now, over the years, as I've taught this and watched others teach this, the thought always comes to my mind, what would I have done? What will I do? Will I look out for number one? Or will I find my moment in time and sacrifice myself for the benefit of others? There are 5 American ideals that America was founded on, and 4 of them are lost. Freedom is the only one that's alive. The danger here is that all 5 American ideals are connected, and with the other 4 lost, freedom is beginning to slip away, and will be lost just like the others unless you and I decide to stop it. So what do? I have 4 simple steps. They'll be the hardest things you ever do, but they're 4 simple steps. 1, build wealth. Well, that's kind of a no-brainer. We have the plan to do that. We have the system in place. We have everything that we need to do that. We just have to do it. Right? Because remember, this is I know this is about building wealth, this whole convention, but for my little portion right here that I get to control, this is about liberty. You want liberty? We need people with wealth to maintain liberty. Build wealth. Then read classics. Now your handout has a list of classics on the back, a very short list of classics that I recommend that you can read. It has the title and the author there. Start that process, read those classics. They're hard. You'll struggle. Good. No one ever grew by reaching up to a bar that was at their chin. The only way you grow is reaching for the bar that's where? Over your head. So good. If you have troubles reading the classics, you want some help with that, call me. Literally. Call me. 435-590-1661. Just call me. I'll walk you through it. As you read those classics, you're going to find things that are poignant. You're going to find principles. When you find those principles, live by them. And then teach it to your families and to your teams. 4 steps: build wealth, read classics, live by the principles you find, and teach it to others. There's a copy of this lecture. There's a link there. You can go there and get that. I don't know what specific challenges lie ahead. I don't know that anybody knows. I hope they're not as drastic or painful as the ones that the founders had to go through. But I do know that ours are overdue. If you think that the troubles we've gone through in 2001 and 2008, that was our time and now we're going to be flying, no, I got news for you. That's not the case. Those were the calms before the storm. I do know this, that when those challenges come, Americans will stand up and face the hardships head on. There will be Americans who have strong families, who are owners, who have missions, who know what to do and do it effectively, who have paid the price to be library educated. Americans who will voluntarily sacrifice themselves and their resources to further the cause of liberty. The number one problem that I've had in the last 20 years is trying to get people who with money to understand that they can only develop that money if they're living in a political environment of freedom. Try to develop that money living in China or some other place that's controlled. Very tough. You have to become part of the system to be able to do it. This is the only country in the world that you can grow and develop in this environment we have. This is shrinking. It all depends on you. Challenges will come and Americans will be there. Choose now to be an American. I say it again, be an American. Choose that today to be an American. In the year 1764, Thomas Jefferson was a broken-hearted college student. James Madison was a sickly schoolboy. John Adams was a disillusioned school teacher, and George Washington was a disappointed businessman. And today, this morning, I have a room full of people just like them. What remains to be seen in the decades ahead is, will you step into your greatness or not? What remains to be seen is, will you become an American? Thank you.
Friends, give it up for Dr. Shannon Brooks.
Wow.